Story 1. The Voice in the Vents. I used to think living alone would be peaceful. No roommates, no unexpected noises in the night, just silence. But silence is deceiving, because when there's no sound, you start to notice things you never would have before, things that shouldn't be there. It started a few weeks after I moved in. The apartment was small but perfect for me. The rent was cheap, and aside from the occasional groan of the old pipes, it was quiet. At least it was at first. Then, one night, I heard it. A whisper. Coming from the air vent above my bed. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind pushing through the ducts, maybe the neighbor's TV. But it happened again and again, always around 3 a.m. At first, the words were too faint to understand. A soft murmur, like someone was having a conversation just out of reach. But one night, when I was lying awake in the dark, I heard it clearly, a voice, breathy, low, and it said my name. I shot up in bed, my skin crawling. My name. It had spoken my name. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the room was silent again. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't alone. The next few nights, I stayed up, waiting. And sure enough, at exactly 3 a.m., the whispering returned. I gathered my courage and moved closer to the vent, pressing my ear against the cool metal. What I heard made my stomach drop. It wasn't one voice. It was many. Dozens of them, overlapping, whispering in a language I didn't understand. And then all at once, they stopped. The air became thick, suffocating. My heart pounded in my ears. And then, so close I could feel the breath against my skin, a single voice hissed, "We see you." I scrambled backward so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My body was ice cold, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I called the landlord. I told him there was something wrong with the vents. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Maybe there was a problem with the ductwork. He came by that afternoon with a flashlight and a toolbox. I stood in the doorway, watching as he unscrewed the vent cover. He took one look inside and went pale. Without a word, he turned and grabbed his tools, hastily putting the cover back on. I stepped closer. "What's wrong?" His hands were shaking. I don't know how to explain this," he muttered, "but there's no duct behind this vent." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard. "I mean there's nothing there, just solid wall." I felt my stomach twist. That wasn't possible. I had heard the voices. Something was inside, watching, listening. And as I stood there, frozen, I heard it again. A whisper, coming from right behind me. Story 2, The Man in the Reflection. I never liked mirrors. Something about them always unsettled me. The way they reflected the world so perfectly. Almost too perfectly. Like they weren't just showing reality, but something else. Something waiting on the other side. That night, I should have ignored it. I should have walked away. But I didn't. It started with a late-night study session. I had an important exam the next morning, and my apartment was silent except for the occasional creaks of the old building settling. The dim glow of my desk lamp barely reached the edges of the room, leaving shadows pooled in the corners. I had been hunched over my notes for hours when I glanced at my mirror. It was a full-length one, leaning against the wall across from me. At first, nothing seemed off, but then I blinked, and my reflection didn't. My blood turned to ice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I must have imagined it. My eyes were tired, playing tricks on me. Slowly, I lifted my hand and waved at the mirror. My reflection did the same, perfectly synchronized. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then, it smiled. My reflection. I wasn't smiling. I stumbled backward, my chair scraping against the floor. My chest felt tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. That wasn't me. It just stood there, grinning, its teeth too white, too sharp. Then slowly, its head tilted to one side. I bolted. I ran straight out of my bedroom, nearly tripping over myself. My breath came in sharp gasps as I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door. The apartment was dead silent. I told myself it was just my imagination. Sleep deprivation. A stress-induced hallucination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to go back inside. The mirror was normal again. My reflection moved as it should. No smile, no delay. But as I turned away just before I switched off the light, I saw it. A handprint, pressed against the inside of the glass. Story 3. The knock at the window. I've always lived on the third floor. It's one of the reasons I chose this apartment. Far from street noise, far from anyone being able to peek into my windows. There's no balcony, no fire escape, just a sheer drop to the pavement below. That's why when I heard the knock at my window, I knew something was wrong. It was past midnight, the kind of late where the world outside is utterly still, where the only sounds are the occasional creaks of an old building settling into the quiet. I had been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, my eyelids growing heavy. The soft glow of the screen was the only light in my room. Everything was peaceful. Until knock, knock. A sharp, deliberate tapping against the glass. I froze. My fingers went stiff around my phone. It was probably nothing, just my imagination. But then, knock, knock. Louder this time. The sound came directly from the window beside my bed. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. My curtains were drawn, blocking the view outside, but the fabric shifted ever so slightly, as if something had brushed against it. My body went cold. I told myself it had to be the wind, but there was no wind. Everything outside was still, and besides, I live on the third floor. With shaking hands, I reached out and gripped the edge of the curtain. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I should have left it alone, but something inside me needed to know. In one swift motion, I yanked the curtain aside, and there, staring back at me through the glass, was a face. Not a person. Not something human. The skin was pale and stretched too tight, as if it had been pulled over a skull that wasn't quite the right shape. The eyes were wide, too wide, gleaming like wet marbles, and the mouth was grinning. A grin so wide it shouldn't have been possible, lips curling unnaturally at the edges. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then slowly, it raised a single bony finger and tapped the glass. Knock, knock. I stumbled backward so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My lungs squeezed, struggling to pull in air. The thing didn't move, it just kept grinning. Then, without breaking eye contact, it pressed a hand against the glass. I watched in frozen horror as the skin darkened, as the fingers seemed to sink into the surface, like the glass wasn't solid anymore, like it was trying to step through. I snapped out of my paralysis. With a shaky gasp, I lunged forward and ripped the curtain shut. The room was dead silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. But eventually I crawled back into bed, wrapping the blankets around myself like a shield. I told myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, the next morning, when I finally found the courage to check, there was a single dark handprint on the glass, smudged as if something had slipped away. Story 4. The room that wasn't there. I know my apartment, every wall, every corner, every creaky floorboard. I've lived here long enough to memorize it. So tell me, how did I wake up one night to find a door that had never existed before? It was around 3 a.m. when I first noticed it. I had woken up feeling strangely disoriented, like I had surfaced from a dream I couldn't quite remember. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle. I reached for my phone, but before I could grab it, something felt off. The room was darker than usual. The glow of the street lamp outside barely seeped through the curtains, and the familiar outline of my furniture felt wrong. That's when I saw it. A door. It was standing at the far end of my bedroom, right where my bookshelf should have been. I sat up slowly, my breath hitching. I didn't own a door there. I knew I didn't. But there it was, a plain wooden door, closed, featureless, except for a simple brass handle. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. And yet, somewhere deep in my gut, I felt this overwhelming sense of familiarity. Like the door had always been there, and I had just forgotten. My fingers twitched, itching to reach out. I should have ignored it, but some part of me wanted to open it. I swung my legs over the bed, my feet meeting the cold floor. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop, but I took a step forward, then another. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, like something was waiting. I reached out, hesitating for only a moment before my fingers wrapped around the handle. It was cold, colder than it should have been. I turned it. The door swung open, and behind it was a room that shouldn't exist. It looked exactly like my bedroom, down to the smallest detail. Same bed, same desk, same curtains, but something was off. The colors were wrong, muted like a faded photograph. The air felt thick, and the longer I looked, the more I noticed the differences. My bed was unmade, even though I knew I had fixed the sheets before going to sleep. My phone was face down on the desk, even though I always left it charging beside me. And then I saw myself, standing in the middle of the room. No, not me. Something that looked like me. It stood perfectly still, its back facing me. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, head slightly tilted forward. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt tight like the air had been sucked from my lungs. Then, without a sound, it started to turn. Not naturally, not like a person. Its head twisted first, then its shoulders, bones shifting with a sickening pop. And when it faced me, I realized it had no eyes. Just empty sockets, black as an abyss. And yet, I knew it could see me. My body reacted before my brain could. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the door handle. But as I tried to close it, the thing smiled. A slow, stretching grin that split across its face like a crack in the earth. And then, in a voice that sounded exactly like mine, it whispered, "I've been waiting." I slammed the door shut. My hands trembled as I pressed my back against it, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. Seconds passed, then minutes. I didn't move. Finally, when I gathered the courage to turn around, the door was gone. The bookshelf was back, like it had never been there at all. But when I crawled back into bed, curling into myself, I knew one thing for sure. It was still waiting. Somewhere. And one day, I might wake up to find that door again. Story 5. The Field That Whispers. I should have never taken that shortcut. The highway was jammed and I was already late. The idea of crawling through traffic for another hour made my skin itch, so when I spotted a narrow road winding through open fields, I took it without a second thought. My GPS hesitated before rerouting. I should have listened to it. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal. The fields stretched endlessly on either side, swaying gently under the moonlight. The road was quiet, too quiet. My headlights illuminated nothing but asphalt and dry grass. Then the air changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere like the world had exhaled. My ears popped slightly, and the hum of my engine suddenly felt deafening against the absolute silence outside. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing in the tall grass just a few feet off the road. I instinctively eased off the gas, my hands tightening on the wheel. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. It stood too still, its form barely swaying despite the wind brushing through the field. But then, it turned its head. Not gradually, not naturally. It snapped toward me. I felt my stomach drop, my pulse hammered against my skull as I forced myself to stare straight ahead, pressing down on the accelerator. The car sped forward, but the road kept stretching. It should have been a short detour, a quick way back to the highway, but mile after mile, I was still surrounded by those endless fields. And then, another figure, further ahead, standing just like the first, motionless, watching. I swerved slightly, my heart slamming into my ribs. As I passed, my headlights swept over its face. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over its skull. A scream built in my throat, but I swallowed it down, my hands trembling on the wheel. This couldn't be real. I was tired, maybe even hallucinating. Then, thud. Something hit my car. A heavy weight landed on the roof with a dull metallic groan. I gasped, nearly losing control. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, my breaths coming in sharp, uneven gasps. And then I heard it. A whisper, right outside my window. "Let me in." I snapped my head to the side. A face was pressed against the glass. It was upside down, grinning. Its smooth, featureless skin stretched, as if something inside was pushing against it, trying to form expressions that shouldn't be there. My scream finally broke free. I slammed my foot down on the gas. My car roared forward, tires screeching against the pavement. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the voice that still whispered, "Let me in! Let me in!" I was flying down the road now, my body numb with terror. The weight on the roof shifted, the metal creaking under its grip. I swerved wildly, trying to shake it off. Then, it was gone. Just like that. I didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the glow of highway lights ahead. My GPS flickered back to life, the signal suddenly restored, the fields were gone, the road behind me was normal, just an empty stretch of asphalt, no sign of anything. I never found that shortcut again. I never want to. But sometimes when I drive alone at night, I hear it. A whisper, soft, persistent. Let me in. Until next time, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and don't forget to subscribe. You never know what's hiding in the dark.